Welcome everyone. I'm hoping that you are all able to hear me. My name is Dr. Shubalade Smith. Everyone calls me Lade usually. This time I'm one of the co-chairs of the International Congress. And this time last year, we were planning our Scottish conference. The plan was that we would be in Edinburgh this week, and we were going to be celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Royal College of Psychiatrists in Scotland. Actually, today I'm speaking to you from my living room in London. I'm told that Scotland is sunny. Here in London, it's a bit wet, I'm afraid. Last year, our International Congress was the most successful one we had ever had. We had more delegates than ever from all over the world. And those of you who were there will know that it was a very enjoyable conference, fantastic educationally. And of course, we had the opportunity to meet with our old friends and make new ones. We don't have that opportunity this time, but I am really pleased to say that there are over 1,000 people who have signed up for this webinar. And short though it may be in comparison, we're hoping to bring you a taster of some of the sessions that we were going to do for the International Congress. And on that note, I would like to remind you to keep an eye out for emails about other webinars that we're going to be doing in the future, which are going to highlight some of the content and some of the sessions that we were going to have for our main Congress. And to remind you, of course, that next year, we hope we're not going to be in the same position as this year, and that we'll see you in person. And we'll see you in person, I think, in Birmingham. So, without further ado, we've got 4 people speaking today. Our outgoing President, Wendy Byrne, David Nutt, who's a professor, emeritus professor. We have Helen Minnis, who's professor in Scotland, and then our new president, Dr. Adrian James. There will be time for questions after all 4 speakers have presented, and please use the question and answer panel on the side of your screen for questions. Do tweet throughout the event. You'll see the hashtag there, hashtag RCPsychLive. And as I say, don't forget about the upcoming webinar series featuring highlights from the Congress. I'm going to tell you a little bit about each speaker, and then I'll hand you over to them. Okay. If you want to register your interest for the Congress, I think there's a link there in the chat, and that's rcpsych.ac.uk. Okay. So, without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to Professor Wendy Byrne. And obviously all of you will know that Wendy is our outgoing president. She's a consultant in old age psychiatry. And she was first appointed in Leeds, 1990. And she still works part-time as a community older adult psychiatrist, her main clinical interest being dementia. She's held regional leadership positions in this area. And really importantly, she's been involved in postgraduate training for the majority of her career. She set up, this is quite amazing, she set up the Yorkshire School of Psychiatry, and she was the first head of school. And she subsequently became the Dean of the Royal College of Psychiatrists and was very important in introducing some fantastic changes to the curriculum. And in 2016, she became co-chair of the Gatsby Wellcome Neuroscience Project, which focuses on modernising neuroscience that's taught to psychiatric trainees. And of course, in 2017, she was elected as the president of the college. The changes that have happened in Wendy's time, I haven't seen the like. And I think when Wendy started, people think of her as being rather understated. But in fact, what Wendy has done is to begin a modernisation programme with the college, the like of which I don't think we've seen before. So I'm going to hand you over to Professor Wendy Byrne.
And thank you, Lade, for that lovely introduction. So yeah, I'm Wendy Byrne, not speaking to you from Scotland, speaking to you from my house in Ilkley in Yorkshire. And yesterday I handed over the presidency to Adrian James, who's going to speak a bit later. Next slide, please. I'm just going to take you very briefly through the past year. We've only got 20 minutes, so I can't say a lot, but I'm going to pick up some of the highlights. I'm going to talk a little bit about funding of mental health services. I'm going to talk about workforce. I'll mention the neuroscience project, a bit about diversity and sustainability. And those are two areas that have become much more important in the college over the past year, and they're going to form a central part of Adrian's presidency. And then, of course, I'll have to talk about COVID because that's affected a lot of the past year since last Congress. Next slide, please. The core purpose of the college, what do we actually do? What is the college for? We set standards and we promote excellence in psychiatry and mental health care. We lead, represent and support psychiatrists. We're not the trades union, we're not the BMA, and we're not the regulator, we're not the GMC. We work with patients, carers and other organisations who are interested in delivering high quality mental health services. And we represent the expertise of the psychiatric profession to governments and other agencies. And that's a big part of the job of the president and the other officers. The funding story starts in 2018. If you remember, there was the NHS's 70th birthday present, and there was an announcement that a lot more money would come to the NHS, with the budget to rise by 3.4% annually. So a really significant investment in the NHS. Next slide, please. Out of that came the long-term plan. So there was an announcement about the money, and then the long-term plan was set up to say how the money would be spent. This was published in January 2019, and there was a commitment to grow investment in mental health services faster than the NHS budget overall for each of the next 5 years. That was quite a hard-won commitment. When we started off talking to people about the long-term plan, there was a thought that mental health services didn't need extra money because mental health trusts aren't overspent. On the whole, mental health trusts live within their means, whereas physical health trusts don't. And that's because we have accepted, and society has accepted, that we just don't treat everyone who's mentally ill. So can you imagine children with cancer if we said, oh, actually, we can only afford to treat a third of them? And that's what's happened in psychiatric services. We've only treated a third of children who need our help. So there was a difficult job to be done persuading the politicians that the fact that we'd lived within our means didn't mean that we didn't need more money. Anyway, we won the battle, and there was a commitment to grow the investment. Next slide, please. So mental health funding is to increase by 2.3 billion a year by 2023. The money is back-ended because we spend it on workforce. We don't have fancy equipment and machines. We spend it on workforce, and it's going to take time to find the workforce. There's very detailed delivery plans. There's an oversight group that holds the government to account and makes sure that the money is spent as it should be. And the president sits on that. I've been sitting on that up until now, and Adrian will take over from me. And this is going to need very close watching in the post-COVID world. We know that there's going to be difficulty with money. We spent a huge amount during the lockdown and during the pandemic, and we know there's going to be a problem. So that's going to need a close eye kept on it, which I'm sure Adrian and other partners will. Next slide, please. So the workforce, that's our biggest challenge to implementing the long-term plan. Recruitment of psychiatrists has been a problem. So the past 10 years, if you look at the increase of all psychiatrists of all grades, it's 4.7% over the last 10 years. In other specialties, the doctors have increased by 26.3%. So a massive difference. You know, we've lagged behind the rest of medicine. And although we are managing to grow our workforce, it's not by much. So over the past year, the workforce, and this is all psychiatrists, has grown by 0.6%. Next slide, thank you. There's an interim NHS people plan that was published in June 2019, and that looks at how many more staff we're going to need to actually deliver everything in the long-term plan. And that's 25,000 more staff in mental health services, so a huge number. That was an interim plan. The final people plan, which will be more detailed, will be published soon. Like so many other things, it's been held up by COVID, but it will be out soon. Next slide. So how can we grow the workforce? We can't deliver the long-term plan. We can't deliver the service that our patients deserve unless we manage to grow the workforce. So we've had the Choose Psychiatry recruitment campaign. Medical schools, we know that we need to increase the number of medical students, and we need to increase the number that actually choose psychiatry. We need to do better with retention. Retention rates in psychiatry are improving, but we still need to do better. And we need to look at other roles. It takes a long time to make a consultant psychiatrist, and we're going to have help to implement the plan in time. Next slide, please. Recruitment is improving. So these are the CT1 numbers that have been recruited starting in August. We have 2 intakes, one in February and one in August, but the biggest intake is in August. This is for England, Scotland and Wales. And you can see how the numbers have steadily crept up. Now this year, the numbers under embargo, the percentage fill rates under embargo, but I can tell you it's as good as it possibly could be, and it should be announced soon. And we've been campaigning for expanding the medical schools, as have other colleges. We've worked with other colleges over this. The number of medical school places did go up by 1,500 in 2018, but that just took us back to where we were before they'd been reduced a few years ago. And we've worked out that to deliver the number of psychiatrists that we need to fully implement a long-term plan and beyond, the numbers need to double. There's an interesting little section in the long-term plan suggesting competition in allocating places to medical school and saying that we should encourage production of medical graduates that actually meet the needs of the NHS, and the extra places should go to medical schools that can do this. And by meeting the needs of the NHS, they mean making GPs and making psychiatrists. Next slide. We've been doing a lot of engagement work with medical schools. We've written a very comprehensive guidance document about how medical schools can provide the best possible experience. That's on the college website if you want to have a look at it. And we've been doing a lot of work going around visiting medical schools and talking to medical students and making sure that they understand how great psychiatry is. Next slide, please. And the college provides a lot of support for medical school psych socs. And here's me actually being photographed with a dog. Those of you who follow me on Twitter will know that I'm really a cat person, but this was Sugar the therapy dog, who I met at the National Psych Soc Conference, a really successful conference that was held in January when the world was still normal and we could all get together. Next slide, please. And as well as recruitment, we need to think about retention, and we need to look after staff. Retention is not rocket science. We know what people want. They want flexibility in their work patterns, they want career development, and they want what I've learned to call hygiene factors, which is access to food, rest, being able to being paid the right amount, being able to book holidays, being able to park their cars, and computers that actually switch on quickly. Next slide, please. HEE has been running a new, HEE is Health Education England, and that's been running a new roles task and finish group. And that's looking at what other roles we can bring in to help psychiatrists. And that's a list of all the different areas that are being worked on. I chaired the group on physician associates. Next slide, please. And the college has been really encouraging physician associates, and council has supported this work. We've set up a network which has 300 PAs and student PAs and consultant supervisors across the UK. These are all people who are interested, either working in the mental health service or interested in working in mental health. And the numbers of jobs are growing. I keep seeing adverts for them. We've held seminars for potential employers. One was held in the college and one was held online. 58 institutions have joined those. And we're arranging a training and education conference for PAs and student PAs. That was due to be held in the college in March, but we had to postpone it, but we're going to do an online event. Next slide, please. And then just very briefly, I'm going to mention the Gatsby Wellcome Neuroscience Project, which I lead. That was originally a 2-year plan, but it was so successful that it was extended to 5 years, and it has another year to run. It runs until next summer. And the aim was to introduce a modern neuroscience perspective into psychiatrists' clinical work. and also to look at how we train our trainees. When we started, the training in neuroscience was quite old-fashioned. It really hadn't been updated for many years. So we've looked at the syllabus for paper A. Neuroscience is examined in paper A. It's taught early on in the NRC Psych courses and examined in paper A. And we looked at the syllabus and we've updated it into a more modern one. Next slide, please. And now we've moved on to really raising awareness of modern neuroscience, which is fascinating. We have an annual neuroscience conference at the college. We arrange lots of talks on it. We have things called brain camps. So a brain camp is for about 50 people, psychiatrists who are involved in teaching. They don't have to have a formal teaching role. Anybody who's willing to go back to where they come from and teach is very welcome. And we have local neuroscientists talking about up-to-date neuroscience, and we do some teaching activities, and we usually make a Play-Doh brain, which is fun. We're going to have to move to virtual events, so we're going to have to work out how to do that and how to try and keep it interactive. And I'll be continuing this work. I'll still be doing this until it finishes in a year's time. So hopefully we'll see some of you at those events. Next slide, please. And then diversity. Diversity has become much more important to the college, and it reflects our core value of respect. We have a speaker diversity policy for all events and conferences. We've increased the proportion from BAME backgrounds who are awarded fellowship. Next slide, please. And we've done a variety of other things. I think Adrian is going to talk a bit more about this. And as a result of all the things that we did, we were named Charity of the Year in the European Diversity Awards. I was very proud of that. Next slide, please. Sustainability. So we've been thinking about that internally within the college. We got rid of all single-use plastic quite a long time ago, introduced vegetarian sandwiches. That wasn't without its difficulties. Not everybody thinks vegetarian sandwiches are nice. And we were in the middle, just as COVID struck, we were in the middle of fitting a revolving door, because at the moment, those of you familiar with the college, there are some sliding doors that open and let in a huge rush of cold air every time they're open. Revolving doors are actually much better for the environment. So one of those is being fitted. Next slide, please. We have a sustainable investment policy. We stopped investing in fossil fuels and we signed up to the Principles of Responsible Investment. That's a voluntary set of principles supported by the UN. Next slide, please. And just recently, you've been able to opt out of paper journals. You can opt out of paper copies. If you want to do this, you just go to the members dashboard and you can just tick a box and you opt out of them. You can opt back in at any time. My cat will be disappointed. That's Simba, my cat. I have to try and get him into every talk. He loves the BJ Psych. He'll be disappointed not to get one. Next slide, please. And we've been working with external organisations. So there's the Centre for Sustainable Healthcare and the UK Health Alliance, and we joined their campaign on air pollution, and they made a video about that. I'm just going to show you a little snippet of it.
I've arrived at the Royal College of Psychiatrists, and with me I've got the President, Wendy Byrne. Wendy, most people can begin to understand how air pollution might affect lungs, might affect a growing baby, but perhaps less able to think about the big impacts that it can have on mental health.
Yeah. We're seeing it right across the age range, so we're seeing developmental disorders in children, more prevalent in places where there's pollution, and dementia in the elderly. So we're learning more and more about the effects of the environment on mental health. And we're discovering that air pollution is linked with dementia, as you might perhaps expect, but also with anxiety and depression and even suicide.
There's a nice little glimpse inside the college for you. Next slide, please. Social media. Social media is increasingly important as a way of influencing and connected. I spend quite a lot of time on Twitter and I've learned a huge amount, and I've engaged with people that I never would have met if it hadn't been for Twitter. Our college Twitter account is huge. It has 91.7 thousand followers. Next slide, please. And a little boast here, I actually went viral September last year, only college president ever to go viral. I did a tweet actually about Kate Middleton in the royal family, just a little joke about that, and then it actually went viral, which at the time was quite worrying, and I had to it was a Saturday morning, and I had to very quickly contact our head of comms and say, I've done a tweet about the royal family, and it's going viral, is that okay? And she said, yes, it's fine. It wasn't rude in any way. And it had nearly 500,000 likes. And I'm actually more famous for that tweet than for being president of the college. I bump into people or meet people where I have to give my name and they say, oh, are you the person that did that tweet? So that's my fame. Next slide, please. So then COVID came at the beginning of this year and changed everything. We've had to change events, conferences, meetings, our buildings, our advice, examination and finances. Next slide, please. So the events, the conferences and meetings have now all been cancelled until the end of the year. We're really hoping that we can restart next year, but people are wanting certainty. I mean, it might even be possible in the autumn, but people are wanting certainty, and it's better to actually cancel things so that people know where they are. And the big conferences that were planned for the autumn, quite a lot of them will take place virtually online. Our last live event was actually the Neuroscience Conference. That was on Friday, the 13th of March, if you're superstitious. Next slide, please. And the buildings. We closed all our college offices in March. The London office, Prescott Street. In fact, Prescott Street has opened very slightly. So Adrian was there yesterday to put on the gold chain as he started his presidency. And we do have a few members of staff, literally a handful, who are going in, but really the building is closed, as are all the other college offices. Next slide, please. And our advice. So when the pandemic really started to get going, I was looking on the website of NHS England and other places, and there was really nothing for mental health services. So our policy team worked really hard, 12 hours a day, and sometimes during the night as well, writing advice and getting it checked. There was a team of members as well who were also working really hard, working hard during the day at work, and then signing off the advice, writing the advice in the evening. And we now have, if you look on the website, there's a huge suite of advice for people working in mental health services and for patients as well. And in fact, that's visited from people from all over the world. Next slide, please. The examinations, we had to cancel paper A and paper B. That was a terrible thing to do. We held on as long as we could. We kept hoping things would get better. I really did not want to be the president who had actually cancelled exams, but in the end we had no choice. We have to keep our trainees safe, so we had to cancel them. The next start of paper A and paper B and CASC in the autumn will be delivered online. And finances, our finances have been quite badly hit. So a third of our finances comes from membership fees. They will keep coming in, but the other 2/3 comes from events, from conferences and from visits that we aren't able to do. So we were looking at a potential £2 million loss of income. Thanks to Paul, the CEO, and the senior management team, that's already been trimmed down to 1.4 million. We have very good reserves. We've been prudent in the past. We own the London offices, so we don't have a mortgage on them. So the college will continue. The college is safe, although my plans have had to change a bit. I should be heading to a spa tomorrow. Next slide, please. So sadly, I won't be heading to the spa. But anyway, one day I'll get there. So thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for the members who elected me as your president. It's been the honour of my life to serve as president. I've only been able to do it with the support of members, and I've tried my hardest to improve the lives of those with mental illness. Thank you. Last slide. Thank you.
So thank you so much to Wendy, and hopefully Wendy's going to keep working with us at the college because she's been such a force for good. So now I would like to introduce Anyway, thank you to Wendy. She's been brilliant, a real force for good. Now we're going to hear from Professor David Nutt. There are few psychiatrists who are known beyond the field of mental health. David Nutt's one of them. He is Safra Professor of Neuropsychopharmacology at Imperial College past president of the European Brain Council, and European College of Neuropsychology. He is the papers, and David is not afraid to have them and to hold his own. He is one of the first psychiatrists who genuinely are understanding about so-called illicit substances. And in fact, when you are deciding your drug of choice for a Friday night. Anyway, without further ado, over to David.
Thank you, Laddie, and thanks also to Wendy. I want to say a thank you. I'm sure all the members and fellows of the college will support me when we say what a wonderful president you've been. Not just dynamic, but also very open and with a great sense of humour. And I presume it's a sense of humour which has allowed you to put up with me for the last 3 years giving talks in this sort of area. So thank you for that. And I decided to sort of be true to form by choosing a rather controversial title, Illegal Drugs and the Future of Psychiatry. The next slide, please. So just to say that I chair a scientific advisory board for a company called Compassion Pathways, who are trying to develop psilocybin as a treatment currently for resistant depression. And both Compass and an organization called MAPS have provided research materials for us. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start with psychedelics, and psychedelics have been around for way before humans. And many different cultures have used them. And the most interesting image in this particular sort of montage is the bottom left-hand corner, where you can see a Greek and noble person partaking of a cocktail of ergot and wine. And those two drugs were the foundations of what were called the Eleusinian mysteries. So whereas Wendy goes to a spa, the Greeks used to go into the fields when the ergot was growing on the rye and have a couple of weeks of celebrating the mystical experiences that combination produce. It's about like going on holiday to, somewhere exotic. But the only difference was, of course, when the Greeks returned home, they did things like invent democracy and geometry, etc. And they genuinely believed that their cultural development was in part fueled by the ability to think differently as a result of that particular psychedelic ergot. Next slide, please. Because the current interest in psychedelics began in the 1950s with the discovery of this semi-synthetic version of ergot called LSD by this man, Albert Hofmann. You see him sitting there in his villa overlooking Lake Geneva at 100. And the first British person to take LSD was a psychiatrist, a professor of experimental psychiatry at Birmingham University in 1953, Joel Elkes, who went on to found the ACMP in America. And he lived to 103. So the idea that LSD use destroys your brain has actually already been put to bed by those two men. But let's get on to the next slide, please, which looks at the way in which LSD was widely used in the 1950s and in the first part of the 60s. It was made available by Sandow as a medicine called Delicid. It was used in many countries, and UK was one of them. And the analysis that was done in 1971 rather by Masters and Houston came to these conclusions that there were 1,000 clinical papers, 40,000 patients, 40 books, 6 international conferences, and they concluded that the results were overwhelmingly positive, describing safe and effective treatments. And LSD was seen definitely in the 50s and 60s as the great revolution in not just psychiatry, but also in neuroscience and brain research. The next slide, please. But then came the war on drugs. President Nixon was looking to get re-elected in 1968. The war in Vietnam was going badly. hippies were taking LSD and complaining against the war. So he just did what many politicians before and since have done, decided to wage war on those people, not on them, of course, but on the drugs they use, because it's a much more tractable and easy concept. So the war on drugs started in 1967. In 1971, the United Nations were persuaded by the Americans to ban LSD and all other psychedelics like psilocybin. And this graph shows the dramatic impact of that ban. So up to 1970, you can see this year on year, massive increase in the number of publications for LSD in blue and psilocybin in red. And psilocybin is magic mushroom juice. And then the ban comes in. There's a couple of years when people have got data to publish, and then there's a catastrophic fall off in publications. And the reasons for that are that research stopped. Before the Red Arrow, the United States NIH had funded over 130 research grants on LSD alone. And since the Arrow, they've funded none. And it's extremely difficult to do research without funding. So basically, the research with psychedelics went into almost a sort of 50-year moratorium simply for political reasons. The next slide, please. But we've been fighting back. And over the last decade, my colleague, Robin Carhart-Harris here, and Amanda Fielding of the Beckley Foundation persuaded me to get engaged in this research. And I thought, well, my career is pretty much over, so whatever I do, they can't do much, against me subsequently. So we decided to start researching psychedelics. And the next slide, please. The next slide shows something completely unpredicted. We found, to our amazement, that when we gave psilocybin in a fMRI scanner, that the impact was not to turn on the brain, as people like Timothy Leary had projected or presumed, but to turn off the brain. And here you see the blue areas of the brain here are areas where psilocybin decreases brain activity. And you can, those of you who know about the brain, that most of those blue areas are actually in the cingulate cortex. And the frontal region, the lowest frontal blue region, is an area called the subgenual cingulate cortex. It's part of the medial prefrontal cortex. And many treatments for depression dampen down that region. And that region's overactive in depression, and it's dampened down by drugs like SSRIs, it's dampened down by CBT, it's dampened down by ECT. Even if you get better on placebo, and that part of the cingulate cortex becomes less active. And also ketamine, the newest antidepressant to emerge recently. So we thought, well, if psilocybin dampens down that brain region, maybe it could dampen it down in depression. And we got more enthused about doing a study in depression because of the next slide. The next slide shows the global impact of psilocybin on the brain, and with a particular focus on a brain network called the default mode network. Now, this has become perhaps the most interesting brain network, certainly in terms of psychiatry and in cognitive neuroscience, because the default mode network is a network that essentially regulates your sense, or contains even your sense of self. So if you just look at the top row of images, there are 3 different ways of looking at the brain, 3 different directions. And you can see this top left-hand image, there's a green blob. The green blob is what we call a seed region. We stick that into the frontal lobe, and we see which parts of the brain correlate with activity in that part of where the green blob is. And it turns out that the posterior cingulate, the bit on the left, the red bit on the left, strongly, the activity there is strongly correlated with activity in this prefrontal region. And if you look to the next image to the right, you see there's a frontal, at the top, there's the medial prefrontal. At the back, there's the posterior cingulate. On either side, there are 2 other red blobs, and those are parts of the parietal lobe. And those 4 brain regions link together, and that's where you encode your sense of self. And one of the main effects of psychedelics is to alter people's sense of self. And the reason they do that was shown in the next image. If you go to the images below, you will see that that correlation between the frontal lobe and the posterior cingulate lobe and the parietal lobes in the middle, they're completely disrupted. And many people describe a fundamental alteration in their sense of self as a result of taking psychedelics. But next slide, please. The default mode network is particularly particularly important in depression. The next slide, because this imaging study done about the same time as us shows very clearly that depressed people have greater engagement of the default mode than normal controls. If you go to the next build, the increased correlation of the default mode in depression strongly correlates with rumination. And it turns out, if you look at the top picture on the right, image B, that the excess activity of the default mode in depression is coordinated by that subgenual region. But what's fascinating is that this is an image of how rumination occurs, or at least what rumination does in the brain. Depressive people, as you know, depressed people ruminate continuously about self-referential guilt, errors, etc. And that rumination is driven through this default mode network. It's over engaged in depression. So we thought, well, if we disrupt the default mode, the psychedelics, maybe they would disrupt depressive thinking. And the first and only time in our research with these drugs, we managed to get funding from the MRC. The next slide. And we did a study, a small study, using 25 milligrams of psilocybin, giving it to people with treatment-resistant depression. They'd all failed on at least 2 drug treatments. They'd all failed on CBT. Some had been on over 10 different drugs. And you can see after a single dose of psilocybin, their depression scores dramatically reduced. And a number of them went into the yellow bar at the bottom, which is basically recovered, not having any depression at all. And some of them have stayed well ever since. The majority slipped back, and that's because depression is kind of entrenched in the brain and is a recurrent disorder. But this was a powerful, the most powerful measure of the effect of a drug on resistant depression there's probably ever been. And as a result of that, now Compass Pathways and other companies are interested in trying to take this further forward and turn it into a medicine. Next slide, please. But we're not the only people working with psilocybin. John Hopkins group have used it to help get people off tobacco. There's a group in New Mexico helping people deal with alcohol dependence. And there are studies now going on. We've just finished a head-to-head of 2 doses of psilocybin versus escitalopram. There are studies on anorexia and OCD, other internalizing disorders like depression, which are going on at our Imperial and John Hopkins, and we're hoping to do a study of heroin addiction, because addiction is another disorder where people become locked into a maladaptive way of thinking, and other opportunities are there for pain syndromes and cluster headaches. But doing this research is really difficult. It's way more expensive than it should be because these psychedelic drugs are illegal. The next slide, please. But I want to finish by saying something also about MDMA. That's a rather beautiful cover of the British Journal of Psychiatry, which shows Sasa Shulgin, the man who sort of resurrected MDMA as a potential treatment, his wife. And the reason for having that on the cover is because Ben Sessa and I wrote an editorial a few years ago arguing that MDMA should be a medicine. The next slide, please. As I said, Shulgin made it as a test drug for the DEA, found it had powerful empathetic effects. His wife was a psychotherapist, and she encouraged the use of it for couples counseling. And it was extremely popular in the West Coast psychotherapy circuit. And then, of course, he got banned. And he got banned because it was legal, and it got diverted into the rave scene. It's changed its name. It was called Empathy, but to make it more popular to recreational users, they changed the name to Ecstasy. That made it illegal. That made it popular. And of course, as soon as kids start doing things that give them fun, that has to be banned. And so it was banned, and it was banned in the UK as well as the US. But it's now been resurrected. The next slide, please. And it's being resurrected because of the horrific experience of PTSD. PTSD is going to be the disorder of this century, largely because we're continuing to fight wars. So there's an American soldier hanging on to an ecstasy tablet somewhere in the Gulf of Arabia. And on the right-hand side, there's a child in Aleppo. PTSD is all around us. And MDMA has the possibility to help people recover from PTSD, as I'll show you on the next slide. This was the seminal study done by the Mithoffers now 10 years ago now, when they took people with treatment-resistant PTSD, they'd not fully recovered on CBT or SSRIs, and they randomized them either to a placebo intervention or to an MDMA intervention. The MDMA intervention being 2 treatments with MDMA, 125 milligrams, 3 weeks apart. And they found that 80% of those patients given MDMA as part of a 16-week psychotherapeutic package did extremely well. 80% went into remission. The remitted ones almost all stayed well for 5 years or more after the treatment. And so the question is, why would MDMA be such an effective treatment for resistant PTSD? And the next slide tells you what we think is going on. So we eventually got through the bureaucratic barriers and did the first proper imaging study of MDMA. And you can see here, the picture is very similar to that with psilocybin. There's no red, there's no increased activity. MDMA decreases brain activity, but not in the default mode network, but in the hippocampus and the amygdala. And those, of course, are the areas where the emotional memory of PTSD is encoded. And we believe that MDMA may be helpful in the therapy of PTSD because it dampens down the emotional reaction to which is inevitably engaged by the exposure therapy, and allows people to hold the memory, hold the emotion for long enough to get control over it, so that eventually they extinguish the emotional responses to the memory. And that's because those emotional circuits are dampened down by MDMA. Next slide, please. And building on that, so Ben Sessa, one part of my team, decided he would do a study of a disorder which is strongly associated with PTSD, which is alcoholism. And possibly the majority of people who become alcoholic, particularly young ones, have been traumatized in childhood. So he basically replicated the PTSD study, but did it in people with alcohol dependence. So it's 2 MDMA sessions, 2 weeks apart, as part of a 12-week abstinence-based program. And it was actually really remarkable. I'm going to share with you, this is the first time we've really talked about this in public, but the next slide shows the results. And so what you see on here are graphs. The top graph looks at the average alcohol intake per week, and the bottom graph, the percentage of patients drinking more than 14 units a week. And there are 2 bars. The red bar are the people who were given the MDMA therapy, and the blue bars are individuals. That's an audit of our clinic. That's an audit of our conventional best practice. And as any of you who work in the field of alcoholism know, that there's actually extremely poor outcomes for treatment of people with alcoholism in conventional therapy. And you can see the top bar there, that our conventional average outcome was extremely bad. People almost went back to drinking as much as they were drinking on average before they entered the trial. Whereas the red line, the MDMA therapy, in alcohol intake was very, very much less. And the bottom line, like the red line here, now becomes the conventional or normal audit, and 75% of patients ended up drinking more than 14 units a week at between 6 and 9 months after the therapy. Whereas with the MDMA therapy, it was the worst outcome was at 6 months, when less than 30% were drinking that much. So these are look like profound improvements in outcome, which are, we believe, occasioned by the fact that MDMA changes the individual's approach to trauma, their own traumas, and also their attitude to alcohol, and allows them to have a more adaptive response to this enduring addiction. So the next slide, please. So what we need to do now is to obviously do a lot more research. I mean, COVID-19, we've already mentioned it. You'll hear more in the next talk. I believe that the enduring damage from COVID-19 will actually be in the psychological field. It'll be people who either had the disorder or who saw healthcare professionals who saw the rather poor way we dealt with the problem, ending up with PTSD symptoms or depression. I think both MDMA and psilocybin should be resurrected to treat people who need them, who haven't responded and who will not respond to conventional treatments. But we've got to get it out of Schedule 1, which basically says it's not useful, and it makes the research very, very difficult. And currently, the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs, a charity called Drug Science, and other organizations are asking for exemptions for researchers for these drugs, because it's not as if the Schedule 1 status has actually stopped recreational use. All it's done is stopped medical research and use. And I would like to ask the Royal College of Psychiatrists to support this, and ideally, because we are going to bear the brunt of the COVID-19 brain problems, ideally lead the other Royal Colleges to support us in terms of having a relatively small but potentially really impactful rescheduling of those two drugs. And the next slide, please. And that's my final slide, to thanks to my team and the funders, the Alexander Mosley Charitable Trust, the Beckley Foundation, and the MRC. Thank you.
We've had a lot to get our heads around the last few months, and that talk is another thing added to the list. That's really fascinating, and big questions there for the Royal College of Psychiatrists. So thank you very much indeed to David Nutt for that talk, and you have the opportunity, remember, to put your questions in the chat function, and we'll have questions at the end of the session. So our next speaker is Professor Helen Minnis, and Helen is a professor of child and adolescent psychiatry at the University of Glasgow. And I've actually known Helen for years, and when I first met Helen, she had come from Guatemala, having been actually an orphanage doctor in Guatemalan for Guatemalan street children. She'd done really incredible things that no one else had done. And she didn't stop there, and she's continued to do really incredible things, real groundbreaking things, actually. She spoke to us when we were very young trainees about attachment disorder and how important it was. We didn't really understand about that, and we didn't understand trauma. And of course, a few years later, she's proved to us all that she was right all along. Attachment disorder is really, really important, and that's the reason why most of us have got patients with mental health problems. So without further ado, over to Helen to tell us a little bit about the trauma in our patients.
Thank you very much, Laddie. What a lovely introduction. So what's behind the trauma? Next slide, please. You may already know about famous Felitti studies on adverse childhood experiences. These are now more than 20 years old, but what they did was ask all of the people signed up to the Kaiser Permanente insurance company, all of the adults, mainly middle-class Americans, to fill in a short questionnaire about their early childhood experiences. And they looked at abuse, neglect, and what they called household dysfunction, things like divorce, which is obviously very common. So these are not necessarily problematic in and of themselves. Obviously abuse is, but it's the sum total of these ACEs, as they called them, that seem to increase our risk. Next slide, please. And what has been found since in so many studies, hundreds of studies, is that there are dose-response relationships between the number of ACEs and both mental and physical health problems. So the relationship between early childhood experiences and depression is old news. We've known that for, gosh, decades, since the Brown and Harris studies. But the dose-response relationship on the right with heart disease was news, and it really shook up the medical and scientific communities that if you have 7 or 8 adverse childhood experiences, you're more than 3 times as likely to develop heart disease in adulthood. Next slide, please. So I like to think of this as the load that the child's carrying. First animation, please. The bigger the load, the bigger the risk. But not all children with a big ACE load will go on to have problems. Thanks, thank you. So what else is going on? We will all know people who've had 7, 8, 9 adversities and are absolutely fine. There'll be many people, many of you watching this will have experienced adversity and survived it. So I want to talk about first maltreatment specific problems. There are a couple of problems that do seem to be specifically related to early abuse and neglect. And one of them is disinhibited social engagement disorder, DSED, which is basically characterised by over-friendliness. And Laddie mentioned that I'd worked in an orphanage. This is a colleague of mine, Rachel Pritchett, in an orphanage in South Africa. And what you see here is children she's just covered in children. You literally couldn't walk forward without peeling the children off. It's a very uncomfortable feeling. And DSED is only diagnosed in the context of abuse or neglect. Next slide, please. In adolescence or adulthood, what you see in DSED is excessive self-disclosure and what we often call boundarylessness. So people who just tell you a bit too much and you're thinking, look at the hand. Next slide, please. The other maltreatment specific problem, and there are only 2 in the DSM, is reactive attachment disorder. And that's characterised by a failure to seek and accept comfort, which often goes along with problems with emotion regulation. RAD is often missed because it's characterised by emotional withdrawal and failure to seek comfort. So it's a quiet problem, but it's devastational for development, because what it leads to is a complete inability to pull in the support of parents, which of course we all need as children. And in adulthood, the kind of developmental outcome of RAD seems to be problems with emotion regulation and trust issues. Next slide, please. We had noticed in our clinical work in our team, we work with abused and neglected children largely, that abused and neglected children tend to have very complex problems. And so I coined this term back in 2013, maltreatment associated psychiatric problems. And if you're an adult psychiatrist, you'll know that many of your most complex patients and their parents will have had a history of early trauma, child maltreatment, or adversity. Next animation, please. And so we had noticed that we know in child mental health that comorbidity, overlap between different problems is common, but it seems to be even more common in abused and neglected children. Next slide, please. So Chris Gilberg, back in 2010, had described the ESSENCE concept, which is early, if you go through the animations, that'd be great, early symptomatic syndromes eliciting neurodevelopmental clinical examination. Slightly tongue-in-cheek term, but what this tells us is, next slide please, that there is huge overlap in childhood neurodevelopmental problems. And so overlap is the norm, not the exception, and symptoms we now know that indicate ADHD or autism often cross diagnostic boundaries, so things like overactivity or poor social interaction. Next slide please. And if you have one neurodevelopmental problem, then attracting more than one diagnosis across the lifespan isn't common. And diagnostic categories can change across development. It may be very worrying in nursery if you have autism because you're not sociable. And then when you go to primary school, the autism may seem less important, but if you've also got ADHD and you can't stay in your seat, that's a problem. And you probably had both diagnoses all along. Next slide, please. Next animation, please, thanks. So in fact, all neurodevelopmental problems, it's now known, share much heritability. Next, please. So this is some work that was done by Chris Gilberg's group in 2013, and they were able to show that a single genetic factor seems to be responsible for the widespread phenotypic overlap among all neurodevelopmental symptoms. Next slide, please. Just as an illustration, if you work with people with ADHD or autism, often they'll have people with ADHD and autism in their families. There'll be an auntie or a cousin or something like that. Next slide, please. So we were interested to know whether this was just a clinical impression or whether maltreatment associated psychiatric problems, this high degree of complexity, really was the case. So next slide, please. And we looked at this in, next animation, please, in the child and adolescent twin study of Sweden, which is a massive twin study involving over 13,000 twins. Keep going, please. And this was published in the JCPP in 2017. Next, please. So the big question was, do children exposed to maltreatment have an increased load of neurodevelopmental disorders compared to children not exposed? Next, please. So in other words, do they have a bigger load if they've of ADHD, autism, etc.? Next slide, please. And the answer was yes. And the difference was even greater than I'd expected. So within that big population of 13,000 twins, there were several hundred children who had had an experience of both maltreatment and neurodevelopmental problems. And among the hundreds of children who'd experienced 3 or more neurodevelopmental problems, keep going, maltreated children were 10 times as likely to be in that complex group. Next slide, please. So we then wanted to know whether it was the abuse and neglect that the children had experienced that was actually causing this neurodevelopmental complexity. Next slide. And we use the co-twin control study. So if you look at the red lines, that's twins who've been maltreated, and their co-twins who haven't been maltreated are highlighted in grey. And the big question is whether the identical twins who haven't been maltreated have the same number of neurodevelopmental problems. Keep going, please. Next slide. Next slide. The answer is yes. And what that shows us is that additional genetic factors, sorry, can you go to, there you go, that's right. Additional genetic factors are causing both the maltreatment and the increased neurodevelopmental complexity. Keep going. And we wonder whether these could be heritable neurodevelopmental disorders. So in other words, something heritable is causing the child to be maltreated and is causing this neurodevelopmental complexity. Perhaps it's parents with ADHD or other neurodevelopmental problems who perhaps are, what we know, for example, that if you have ADHD, you're at higher risk of substance misuse. And if you then have a child born to you with ADHD, that might be a toxic environment in which maltreatment can develop. Keep going. So if you just want to go through the animations here, clinicians should be aware that if your patient's been exposed to abuse and neglect, he or she is very likely also to have neurodevelopmental problems. In other words, your most complex patients might have both a history of abuse and neglect and neurodevelopmental problems like ADHD, tic disorders, autism, learning disabilities. Next, please. And what about PTSD? Keep going. Intrusive thoughts, nightmares, and flashbacks. Next slide, please. Next animation. The idea of complex PTSD includes the more traditional symptoms, flashbacks, avoidance, hyperarousal. Next animation, please. Keep going. But in complex PTSD, there are thought to be also problems regulating emotions, problems with emotional withdrawal, problems with affect regulation. Keep going. Could these symptoms actually be attachment disorder symptoms, RAD and DSED? Keep going. It's very complex. We just go through the animations here. Overlapping neurodevelopmental problems, changes through development, symptoms of adult-type psychiatric disorders like anxiety and depression can sometimes look like neurodevelopmental problems. It's very complex. Next. And PTSD. I think it's easiest if you tackle this in packages. Think about RAD and DSED, ADHD, neurodevelopmental problems, PTSD, and then adult-type problems like anxiety, depression, and psychosis. Going, please. So to have a genuinely trauma-informed approach, for me, it really is important to do a good formulation. Next. Just go through the animations here. This is often quite a scary prospect, particularly for adult psychiatry colleagues who are maybe not used to thinking about neurodevelopment, but there are excellent standardized tools, brief checklists, pull in expert colleagues, and it's really helpful to know that your treatment is likely to be more effective if you have understood your patient's neurodevelopmental profile. Next, please. And I like to think about this as helping your patient understand his or her make and model. And you may want to think diagnostically, are you a Honda or are you a Toyota? Or you may want to think about the details of what that means. What litre engine do you have? Next. That's all I want to say, and I'd be really interested if there's time for some questions about that. Thank you. Oh, I should say I have no conflicts of interest.
Okay, so that was really fascinating. Thank you, Helen. That was great. That's fantastic. So a lot of food for thought there again. Certainly you described a number of my patients. I work in forensic psychiatry, and yeah, I think the big public health message, however, though, for me is be kind to your kids, because whatever's happening with them neurodevelopmentally, if you're kind to them, they're less likely to have problems later on. Anyway, our final speaker is our new president. That's Dr. Adrian James. So Adrian's actually also a forensic psychiatrist by background, but a bit of an uber one. He trained at Guy's Hospital Medical School, and then went to Devon, where he is actually the former medical director of Devon Partnership NHS Trust and the founding chair of the School of Psychiatry at Peninsula Deanery. That was from 2006 to 2008. He has been clinical director for the mental health, dementia and neurology, working for NHS England Southwest. And in addition, he's also been a reviewer and clinical expert for the Healthcare Commission and its successor organisation, of course, the CQC. He's chaired review groups on integrated care systems, cannabis, prevent and learning from deaths. And he also set up the QI Committee and Workforce Wellbeing Committee at the college. Of course, he was recently our college registrar, and most recently, he was elected president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists in January 2020, and he's taken up the role from yesterday, and he's got quite a big task ahead of him, I think. Thank you very much. Over to Adrian.
Hello everyone, thanks very much for joining us, and Nade, thanks so much for your introduction. So I want to set out my vision for the college over the next 3 years during the course of my presidency. So next slide. So I think I do have a vision. It's spelt out in my presidential statement that you elected me on, but I have no intention of going it alone. I'm going to require the input of all of you, all 18,800 members, and also the support of the leadership team at the college. And this has been strengthened in recent days. It's been partly strengthened by you because you elected a new registrar, Trudy Seneviratne, who I think will bring particular qualities to that role. And she'll be working alongside Kate Lovett, our Dean, and Jan Palkowski, our Treasurer. And of course, we have Paul Rees, our Chief Executive, and all our amazing college staff. And I really wanted to pay tribute to them during COVID-19 because they've done an amazing job to actually keep the college up and running. So in addition, I've appointed 3 brand new presidential leads. Lari Smith, who obviously know, she's chairing today, and Raj Mohan, who are our presidential leads on race equality. And alongside them, Mohammed Al-Uzri, who is the presidential lead for international affairs. And I'm really pleased that this will focus our attention on areas that are important, I know, to all of you. But I have 3 other presidential leads. They've been reappointed, their posts were advertised, but Neil Greenberg for military and trauma, Richard Williams for COVID preparedness, obviously vital at this particular time, and Helen Bruce, who's still focusing on 0 to 25 services. So if I can have my next slide, please. So my 4 priorities are equity between physical and mental health, championing diversity, supporting the workforce, and putting sustainability at the heart of all we do. Now, immense progress has been made at improving support for people with mental illness in the UK over the last decade, but there's so much more we need to do and further we need to go. So COVID-19 has thrown an unexpected disruption and diversion into an already challenging journey towards delivering further equity for mental health. And it's exacerbated deep societal inequalities. And that's why I appointed 2 new presidential leads on race equality. But the journey towards the vision for equity for people with mental illness must continue. And so I'm setting out today the key college action under my 4 priorities. And these will be discussed further and consulted at our strategy day in October. So your other elected representatives, whether that be faculties or divisions, will come together and we'll discuss the priorities further. So next slide, please. So these are not in any particular order, but the first one I'd like to look at is equity between physical and mental health. So we've made huge strides in recent years, and some services have shown tangible improvements. There's been investment in perinatal, in liaison services, completely transformed. And I think it's very important to demonstrate that if you put money into mental health services, you see real results. And I think politically, this is very important because there was a political myth really that you could throw any money at mental health and it really wouldn't make any difference. We've shown that it can, but at the same time, I'm very much aware that many of you who are joining us today will feel that there's been no progress, and in some areas things have got actually even worse. So I want to develop a plan that says, what is the end point of parity? What does it mean in terms of access to services, outcomes and patient experience across all our specialties? Next slide, please. But this is going to involve fair funding for safe and high quality mental health services, preventing people with mental illness falling between the gaps in terms of accessing the services, and narrowing the gap and addressing the physical health inequalities faced by people with serious mental illness, intellectual disability and autism, and ensuring outcomes of people with mental illness don't lag behind due to inequalities in research. Research is still underfunded relative to physical health, 23% of the disease burden for mental illness and only 7% of the research funding. So whilst the focus on mental well-being has been very welcome during COVID, and I think that's helped us, it's as essential as ever that the support for people with severe mental illness is not lost in all of this. And they're often the people who are not phoning helplines. And so we need to make sure that there's a continued focus on them. So in terms of physical health inequalities, cruelly, it's no coincidence that those who are at the highest risk of mental illness and often have the worst access and experiences of support, including older adults, those with intellectual disability and autism, people who've experienced trauma, as we were just hearing, and abuse, and people living in poverty, they have been most exposed to the direct and indirect harms of COVID. And I think this may well worsen with an economic downturn. And of course, there's been a major differential impact on people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities, although I'm aware within that phrase that there's huge diversity, and that phrase doesn't fully reflect how many people feel. So pre-existing inequalities have been exacerbated by the crisis. COVID-19 hasn't been the great leveller. It's sought out inequality and diversity. And this particularly applies applies to those with severe mental illness. So in relation to research, we've got an amazing academic community, but their funding and support has been pitiful. And inequalities in research perpetuates inequalities in solutions and in turn outcomes for patients. And we really need to do something about it. Now, my 4 priorities cover the whole of the United Kingdom and also through our international strategy, the whole of the world. But the devolved nations have a really important part to play. I don't want to steal their limelight, particularly Maria and Richard, who are taking up their new offices today in Wales and Northern Ireland, along with John Crichton in Scotland. However, I just want to share 3 things, one from each nation. So in relation to Scotland, the College in Scotland will be working to ensure the review of the legislative framework brings about improvements to those with mental illness or incapacity, but also ensuring that it's practical and incorporates a needs-led approach. In Northern Ireland, the college there are leading a campaign to improve the currently very scant data on mental health and using that to influence policy and campaigns. And in Wales, they've launched a manifesto for the Welsh Parliament elections in 2021, calling on the next Welsh Government to ensure parity between physical and mental health and the right access to services. Next slide. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic and the killing of George Floyd in the US and the subsequent global growth of the Black Lives Matter movement have shone a light on the impact of inequalities, inequity, and discrimination on health outcomes. And I think this is an opportunity for the college to build on some of the work that it has done, but we really need to go much, much further. And we need to make it integrated into everything that we do. I want to assure each and every one of you that I don't see this issue as being something that a small group can go away and look at and sort out. It must involve all of us and all parts of the college. So racism and racial discrimination is one of the many factors that can have a significant negative impact on a person's life chances, and mental health and health and mental health. And this has been recognised recently by the Chief Executive of NHS England. Next slide. So in terms of championing diversity, we'll be looking at improving outcomes for those with the poorest outcomes and access to services, particularly people from BAME communities, and putting that at the centre of the college's business. There is no quality without equality, and we'll be supporting those working in services to rapidly respond to and deliver change that works for all patients. And we'll be supporting staff with mechanisms to address inequalities to be included within work plans to ensure BAME staff are supported. Now, this will involve the college getting its own act together and put its own house in order. And there will be a race equality action plan. And we will also be looking at decolonising the college and looking at everything that we do. So looking at our curriculum, as Kate Lovett said yesterday, we'll be looking at our policies and everything that the college does. But we'll also be looking at inequalities for other groups, so particularly LGBTQI+ groups. So we want to look at inequalities across the whole of the college. Next slide, please. The college has already taken 2 recent actions. So a task and finish group was set up, chaired by Ananta Dave, and I'm really grateful for the work that she's done. Showed tremendous leadership in producing something which was recognisably right and usable in a very short period of time. So she produced, working with others, guidance on risk assessment and mitigation for all UK mental health services. And this was first published in May. And she's also come up with some actions which I've agreed to take forward with the ongoing work that we'll do on equality and diversity. Next slide. So we've also appointed the two presidential leads, and their key responsibilities will be to feed into the college equality strategy, to promote the recommendations in our already position statement on racism and mental health, and to advise council, trustees and senior management team on effective options going forward. And there will be an action plan. And I want to make sure that we can create something which is sustainable going forward. This is not an issue that can just be dealt with and then we all forget about it. We want to create a college structure that will be sustained beyond my presidency. So next slide. Supporting the workforce is one of my top priorities. Obviously a healthy workforce provides better services for patients, and workforce well-being is absolutely key to retention. So next slide, please. Today we have launched a 3-year strategic workforce plan, and there are 2 key elements to this: to innovate recruitment and working practices to secure a mental health workforce fit for the future, and to improve retention, well-being and the culture at work and build a resilient workforce. So the college has always worked hard to recruit and retain psychiatrists, but this is the first ever college-wide workforce strategy that's publicly available. And it gives a clear direction to recruit and retain a psychiatric workforce, delivering high quality, safe care. We will also, within this, look to combat racism within the profession. And our 2 newly appointed presidential leads on race equality will work to ensure psychiatrists and Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds have equal access to career opportunities and received fair treatment and appropriate support in the workplace. Now, this is not only the right thing to do, it's actually good for organisations. Organisations that address equality and diversity perform better, and this gives better results for our patients. So it's the right thing to do, but it improves outcomes. We'll be taking action to retain a well-supported workforce. We lose too many people, trainees and people later in their career, because they don't feel supported. And if we can support them, they'll want to carry on doing their jobs. So in relation to recruitment and retention, we've got a campaign for medical school places to be doubled. I was speaking to the president of the Royal College of Physicians about this, and they're very much in alignment with us on this. I think there's a real opportunity to grow our medical schools. Campaign for psychiatric training places to be increased. Promote psychiatry to secondary school students so they're encouraged to want to have a career in mental health. And expand flexible and working practices and credentialing, including flexible retiring and return offers. Too many psychiatrists I hear want to come back to work, but they can't do so because they don't feel supported. I think we're getting towards the end of our time now. I'm just going to say something very briefly about sustainability, so if we can move on. Climate change poses a significant challenge to global mental health, and so the RC Psych is acting on its responsibilities, and we set up an expert reference group to scope a college action, and they'll be looking at the Royal College and the climate emergency impact on mental health, which is considerable, climate emergency and specific impacts on patient groups, and also on public health. Next slide, please. So we'll put sustainability at the heart of what we do, and we'll be developing a sustainable college response to the climate emergency and ecological crisis. We're also developing an international strategy, and that will be published soon. Next slide. So the college has 18,800 members, over 89 countries, and 3,357 of them, or 18%, are based outside the UK. We have our international divisions, and our international strategy will look at some of our priorities, including expanding volunteering programs, expanding training courses, further developing the MTI scheme, translation of our books and journals. We have a huge educational resource that is not fully open to those who need it most in the world. And we'll expand the number of international member categories. Next slide, please. International Congress, unfortunately, had to be cancelled this year. We're very optimistic that next year in Birmingham that we will meet together, but we'll have to keep an eye on that with the COVID situation and whether there are further waves. Next slide. So all this will come together in a college strategic plan for 2021-23. Between now and September, there'll be college working groups set up to look at the 4 main priorities. Some are already underway. 22nd of October, we have our strategy day, and then the plan will be published in December. Next slide. Finally, our college building. I was there yesterday, and say it is feeling a little bit sad without all of you. But as I said yesterday, the college is not a building, it's all of you, every single one of you. And we need to come together at what has been a traumatic time for so many people with COVID-19. I'm sure this will pass. And I feel that we can actually grow something which is very different and very positive. And I will need all your help and support in order to do that. So thank you very much for listening.
So thank you very much, Adrian. Adrian has outlined a really ambitious plan for the next 3 years. Now, there are loads of questions, and we really don't have time for all of them, because the one thing I do need to do, because I've not been at chairing, is to finish on time. So what we thought we would do is there'll be a question for Helen and a question for David. The rest of the questions we are going to answer offline, and we are going to have a kind of frequently asked questions approach, if you like. So certainly all the questions for the president will be answered there, and hopefully David and Helen will be able to answer some other questions too. So a quick question for Helen. Helen, there's been lots of positivity, and in particular a massive, huge, in capitals, thank you from a child psychiatrist in South Africa, who unfortunately didn't leave their name. But there are questions. There's a question about the impact of or essentially there's a question from hold on, let's get the person's name here. There's a question from Victoria Stamps, who works in the military, asking about ADHD and noting that ADHD is people with ADHD are more susceptible to trauma because of their high alertness and observation, coupled with difficulties working through experiences. Is this something that you've observed, and is there any research that supports this?
So great to get that question. No, I don't think there is, but we are really interested in looking at ADHD as an exposure in terms of other negative things being an outcome. And I think that's absolutely right. I think also the impulsivity of people with ADHD, they'll sometimes go into the pub and say things and they'll be out their mouth before they've even thought that they're going to get punched. So there are many ways in which I think a person's neurodevelopmental profile can actually kind of create either a positive or a negative environment. So, good question.
Thank you.
And I should also just mention that in the context of COVID, in the pandemic, we've been doing some research, some qualitative research, interviewing families about how they're coping. Families with children who have neurodevelopmental problems, or where adults have neurodevelopmental problems, are struggling a lot more.
Okay, thank you. That's really interesting. Okay, and final question for Professor Nutt. So there are loads of questions, actually, David.
Absolutely. I answered a lot of.
Okay, good. I think the questions that, because people may not be able to see the answers, so the people will have seen, so the individuals might have seen the answers, but they might not, people may not have been able to see the answers in total. But there are lots of questions about, dosing, about who's going to provide it, etc. But there's one which perhaps encompasses the question, particularly about psilocybin, LSD, etc., which is, okay, in real life, if this were to be become mainstream treatment, how would it work? Does the person get, does the person have the medication in the clinic? Do they take it home with them? How does it work? What happens? And what about addiction potential?
Yeah, these drugs aren't addictive, they're anti-addictive. They desensitize. If you take them more than 3 times in a week, the effect disappears. They're anti-addictive. They've been mislabeled as addictive. I've got an editorial coming out in JAMA Psychiatry in the next week or so, which covers all these sort of issues that I think people have raised. But the vision is that this is not psychopharmacology, and this is not psychology. This is the bringing together. This is using a psychedelic drug to facilitate psychotherapy. So it will be these are intensive psychotherapy sessions where people get access to unconscious or subconscious experiences and repressed memories through the psychedelic. So I see psychiatrists being absolutely central to providing this treatment in clinics, which hopefully will be somewhat nicer than the sort of ECT clinics that people are getting other forms of drug administration in clinics now. So it'll be very much an expert-led and driven therapy.
Okay. And so would you envisage that the psychiatrist is delivering the psychotherapy, so we'd have to improve our psychotherapeutic skills as well?
I'm not sure you have to improve them very much. I think you'd have to learn how to deal with some of the unusual, different kinds of ways of people present their experiences. But no, I think our clinicians, our therapists are generally trainee psychiatrists, and it works very well with them. So I don't think you don't need a special training in psychotherapy. You do need a little bit of training in how to work with perhaps some of the slightly weirder things that might come up. Just to make sure you and your patients are protected against possible unwanted actions. But generally, the sessions, though they're challenging, haven't led to any major complications.
Okay, so there's a question from a medical student, and actually what they're asking is, does this mean that if they become a psychiatrist in 15, 20 years time, is this going to be mainstream treatment?
Well, I hope sooner than that. I'm hoping to see it mainstream before I die, and I'm getting pretty old.
No. Okay.
Yeah. I think there's a good chance that both psilocybin and MDMA will be available as medicines as 5 years, and if we can get them rescheduled soon, then that is absolutely practicable, because the studies are going on at present, and if we'd increase them 5-fold if the drugs were not Schedule 1, in which case we could have it in 5 years if the evidence pans out. And the effect sizes so far are huge. It's very unlikely that they're not going to work.
Okay, well, folks, you heard it here first. Okay, so I think on that note, we are just coming up to 5:30. I would like to thank all our speakers and thank all of you who stayed with the webinar. It's been a really fascinating afternoon, actually, and I feel slightly disappointed that it's not happening for real and that I'm not seeing you in person. But we're going to carry this series on because it looks like it's very popular. And I want to remind you if you've already signed up for this, then you do have a look at the college website for further webinars. We've got our South Asian History Month coming up. So definitely we've got to think about webinars for that. And also some highlights from the Congress. We will be back next year. And what I'm hoping is that we're going to be able to get our speakers from today and from the conference who should have been speaking, who are going to talk to us in person, and you'll then be able to color them and ask them huge amounts of questions, all the questions that we weren't able to get in today. So, and thank you very much to Wendy, our outgoing president, and welcome to Adrian, our new president-elect. Thank you. Oh, and there's something you meant to do, isn't it? Everyone meant to clap at the end. So if you could clap at home, thank you. Have a good evening.